Hi, I'm Samar Shams. I'm an immigration and global mobility partner at Spencer West. And today I'm going to talk about sponsorship and in particular, how sponsors can demonstrate how they've identified a candidate for sponsorship where the resident labor market test is no longer required. So in December 2020, the Home Office abolished the resident labor market test for most sponsorship matters. Now, existing sponsors were very, very careful to follow the resident labor market test requirements when it was in effect, taking the right screenshots on the right dates, making sure all the information was there. And now I find that they're a bit uneasy. A lot of people approaching me about how they identified a candidate are a bit uneasy and unsure what documentation needs to be kept now that the resident labor market test is not officially required. So let's talk a bit about that. If you advertise a role, despite the resident labor market test not being required, then you should keep the copy of the advert, and it doesn't have to be a screenshot necessarily. It can be a copy of the text of the advert. If you place multiple adverts, it's best to keep copies of all the adverts placed. And then you also have to keep certain other records around that recruitment. So the location of the advertisement has to be evident from the documentation on file. The start and end dates, the number of people who applied for the role, and the number of people who were shortlisted for interview. Also, in addition to that information and the copies of the adverts, you have to keep one more document that relates to the evaluation process, when in a case where you've advertised the role. So that could be interview notes from the successful candidate, or a list of questions that you ask all the interviewed candidates, or just notes on why you selected the successful candidate and rejected the other candidates. So that's what you should keep on file if you have advertised the role, despite advertising no longer being strictly required under the resident labor market test. Now, if you didn't advertise the role, and it is no longer required to advertise the role, you do have to have on file an explanation of how you identified the candidate. And the Home Office is not terribly prescriptive about the ways in which you might have acceptably identified a candidate. So they give some examples. First of all, they give the example of somebody who's working for you, perhaps on another visa before being sponsored. And maybe they've shown that they have the necessary skills and experience through performing their role for the sponsor previously very, very well. Or you might have identified a candidate through what's called a university milk round, where an employer goes around to various university career fairs, say, and interviews various candidates there. Or it could be that the candidate made a speculative application. So there was no job ad running for this role, but they approached the sponsor and were found to meet the skills and experience requirements for a genuinely vacant role. But again, those are examples. In any of those cases, it is best to keep as much documentation on file, as well as the explanation of how they were identified. But there could be other ways that a company might have identified a worker. So for example, maybe they worked for the company on a contract basis remotely from overseas. We're seeing that quite a bit lately. So it's worth thinking about how you truly identified somebody and how you're going to evidence that they meet the requirements and that you followed a proper process when evaluating them. So I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions about evidencing how you identify a candidate or about sponsorship in general, or any immigration queries, just get in touch. My email is samar, samar.shams@spencer-west.com. Thanks very much.